Good evening again.
Hello.
See if this all works. It will warm up. Let's just start with a quick prayer. Our gracious Father, we do thank you again for this night. We thank you for these faithful people that have come out, that are trying to learn. And Father, again, I ask that you would give me words that will help us all to be able to understand your glory and to be able to praise and worship you even more. So Father, we just thank you for this time that we have and just ask that you continue to be with us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Before I start on this, last week I gave my testimony about what happened to me as I was growing up. One of the things since I've done that, I've gone to many different churches. I have yet to find a perfect church. There is no such thing as a perfect church. But the one thing that I have found is that when I go to a church, the one thing that I want to make sure that I have is good, solid teaching from the Word. I've been to churches, I've been to other churches here in Hope, and they're wonderful churches for entertainment. But I haven't even seen people with a Bible. So again, make sure if you ever go somewhere that you are into a church that has good teaching in whichever way you can. And again, I would like to thank Dean because he is a really good teacher and I think we all appreciate that. He does an excellent job for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for listening.
So tonight, you don't have Dean, you have me. Tonight we're going to be talking about fossils and dinosaurs. Now to me, these are fascinating things. Now we all know that dinosaurs died 65 million years ago, the last of them, right? But we'll get to that in a few minutes. Now, first thing is fossils. Let's start looking at fossils. And the first question we want to ask is, what are fossils? Anybody want to hazard a guess? You want me to just tell you? Okay. They are the remains or traces of plants or animals that are in rocks. All right? We're going to talk about how that happens in a minute. So just remember, they're the remains of plants and animals that are formed in rock. So how is it formed? Is the next question. In every case, the plant or the animal has to be buried rapidly. It's in water and sediment. If something dies, just imagine now, a fish that's swimming around and it dies. Do you think that body sinks to the bottom and then sinks into the mud and fossilizes? No, there's too many scavengers. It has to happen very quickly. And then again, we've got to start thinking about where do these things happen. So it could happen, for example, with an underwater slide. You know, you could have a mudslide. Fish swimming by and the mud comes down. And now it's buried. And then we'll talk in a minute again about what happens from there. How long does it take for these fossils to form? We consistently hear in the secular world that it takes thousands, millions, all kinds of time to make a fossil. But it depends on the conditions. And it can be a few years, a few decades, or centuries. I'll give you one example. It was somewhere around 1908, a miner in Australia had his foot cut off in an accident. In the late 80s, they found his foot in the boot that he lost. It was totally fossilized. It was a solid piece of rock. So in 70 years, on this mine, it became a total fossil. So fossils can happen very quickly. Now, before I even get into this one, how many fossils, I want to just mention this. What happens is when something is buried, over time, the minerals that are in that ground come in and they start replacing the cells that are in the thing. They'll start filling up blood vessels, they'll start doing this. And it will become an exact replica of what was there. All it does is just replace the living things. The living things are actually just moved out and then they die off and then that rock is left there and it becomes part of the rock. I had an opportunity a few years ago. Does anybody ever heard of a thing called an Arcterypix? It's what evolutionists claim was the first bird that came about from a reptile. And literally, I had a fossil. It was about 18 inches square. And it was this entire fossil. The wings, the feet, the head, everything was there. And I had the opportunity to make a display case, and it's in a museum somewhere down in Texas now. But these things are absolutely fascinating when you find them. So, how many fossils do we know about? Astounding. There's 250 million fossils that are cataloged, and there's 25,000 species that are represented in these fossils. So there's lots and lots and lots of fossils. Now we're going to give a little bit of an explanation of how these come. The red line represents all the fossils. Every fossil that we know about. So we've got millions and millions of fossils in that red line. Of that line, 95% are marine invertebrates. Invertebrates means it has no skeleton. It's basically like a shellfish, okay, as I said here. Shellfish is just a shell, and it's just that blob that lives inside. So, and that's the great majority of them. So 95% of that 250 million fossils that we know are these shellfish. They are invertebrate marine creatures. Now, I'm looking now at just that last 5%. Just that 5%. So this line here now represents just that 5%, okay? 95% of that 5%, remember it's just 5% we're looking at, 95% are algae and plant fossils. Okay? Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the remaining 5% of this bit, which is a very small number now. And we're just looking strictly at that last little bit there. And of that bunch in there, 95% are invertebrates. Again, they don't have a skeleton. Insects, flies and bugs and beetles and so on. They don't have skeletons. So 95% of all of that little bit are insects. Now again, we're going to look at the last little bit way over there as another line. And now we have vertebrates. These are creatures that have a skeleton. Most of them are fish. All right? So we've got 250 million. 100% is 250 million. On the next part here, we have 5% that are taking up mostly algae and plant fossils. Now we have 1/4% of all the fossils are insects. And finally, we have 1/80th of 1%, which includes all of the vertebrates, and they're mostly fish. All right? What's the question? What about animal and human fossils? They're included in that 1/80th of 1% of the vertebrates. All right? So you can see what a small sample we have. 95% of land vertebrate fossils, that means all animals, whether they're cows or whether they're dinosaurs or whether they are humans, consist of one single bone. 95% of them. There was something I was just going to throw in here, I forgot. Okay, I just remembered, I've got notes here too. So let's look at some of my notes here in this thing. So, in the invertebrates in that first bit there, if I go back here, come on, I'm supposed to be able to go back. No, I went back too far. We'll get to this. Okay, of this bit here, snails, squids, jellyfish, trilobites are included in all of these marine invertebrates. So there's all kinds of things. Now, a trilobite, people always talk about trilobites. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but when you get into looking at fossils, everybody's looking for trilobites. Trilobites, people, they want to say that it's a very, very simple creature, right? But it's not. It's an extremely complex creature that used to live. Now, when fossils, or when these things die, and they go down to the bottom, the theory in evolution is things that lived millions and millions and millions of years ago die first, and they're on the bottom. Then, later on, something else dies, and they're buried above it. And then something else dies, and it's buried above it. And then something else, right? So we should not find humans until we get up near the top, right? So that's the theory in that thing. The problem is, in most cases, they're all mixed up. Sometimes you'll have humans below trilobites. Sometimes you'll have some trilobites and then humans and then some other things. And the whole thing is mixed up all the time. There has never yet that I'm aware of been found a column that shows exactly the way evolution says it should be, in the way it's buried. When you get to evolutionists and they're looking at these things, what they want to see is an indistinct evolution of characters. In other words, if we are frogs, if we were frogs at one time and that frog became something on land, and eventually it became a monkey, and then we should find stages to cut closer and closer to humans, and that's what they want to see. The problem is for evolutionists is that they have never ever found intermediate forms for anything. If they find a dog, right, fossil, it's a dog. It's a dog that we would recognize today. It's there. There's nothing that leads up to it. So there's nothing in these evolutionary things that throw this out. Darwin himself, when he wrote his book back in the 1850s, said that the most serious objection to evolution would be the lack of fossils. They didn't have very many fossils back then. And he said, we've got to have fossils to prove evolution. If we can't find these intermediate changes, then there's going to be things there. The question that people would say is, should we throw out the theory or should we throw out the facts? Evolution throws out the facts and maintain the theory. They live on that theory of evolution alone. And today, with all the different fossils we found, there's even fewer transitional forms of anything that we can find. And we're going to get into a lot of those. As you look at the fossil record, there's extinction. Trilobites are extinct, but there's no way that anybody's ever seen an evolution in there. Theory of evolution now says that what happens is everything goes along and then all of a sudden there's this huge change. There's no intermediate changes. It just all of a sudden a dog becomes a cat. That's the theory of evolution. It's called punctuated equilibrium. Because they can't find anything, so they said, well, obviously then it must just happen, boom, a dog becomes a cat. Nonsense, but anyway. So, we'll just run back through these, get out of this again. Animals and so on. Okay, so the question now is they find a fossil. And now how do scientists know what these things are? Remember, it's a single bone. So this concept of morphology, for example, is one thing. The shape, what does it look like? So here's an example. Apes are a U shape. The jaw is a U shape. Humans are parabolic. It's a round curve. It doesn't, go out into a round. It doesn't go straight and in it. It's a parabola in here. So if they find a jawbone somewhere that's in between a parabola and a U, then it's an intermediate form. All right. Now, do you think they ever find complete jawbones? So occasionally, there's very few of them, but we'll see some of these. All right, the second example here, the brain case, if they find, the skull. Apes run between 300 and 400 cubic centimeters, where humans are about 750 to 2,000 cc's. And remember, the size of your head, the size of your skull has no meaning of intelligence, right? So it doesn't matter. You can have a very small skull and you can be very, very intelligent. You can have a big skull like me and be stupid. So the thing is, it's not there. But what they're doing is they're basically looking, and if they find a brain skull and it's somewhere, at 750 or 500 or 600, then they're trying to say, well, it's evolved between an ape and a human. That's the concept that they're using. So that's morphology. The other thing that they use is time. How long ago did the fossil die? How long ago did that creature die? Now the question is, it's based on where they find it. And this is what you're going to call circular reasoning. Because if you go to Drumheller in Alberta, and they tell you that this dinosaur died 65 million years ago, the question to ask is, how do you know? Well, the scientists tell us that the rock we find it in is 65 million years old. Wonderful. Go to the geologist and say, how do you know this rock is 65 million years old? Because they found a dinosaur bone in it. Seriously, that goes on a lot, right? Basically, it's called circular reasoning. It's 65 million years old because the rock is, but the rock is because there's a dinosaur there. So there's no scientific proof in that. Now, so the strategist basically says the ground that they find it in. So if you have an old fossil and you find a modern one with it, if you find a trilobite and you find a human skull, the trilobite can't be ancient, for example, because the humans are too new. So if the strata says it's 3 million years old, the bone can't be a human bone because humans weren't around that long ago. Humans only came around between 1 and 2 million years ago. There's some astounding things we're going to get into next week when we talk about that. So it's either the fact that if there's a human bone there, whatever else is with it, can't be that old because the humans weren't around that long ago. Or else somebody's dated the rocks wrong. Right? So there's all kinds of things. And that's what they're doing, is they're trying to use time. Now, here's some of these things we're going to do. There's examples of anthropological fossils. Anthropology is the study of human fossils. Right? Now, every one of these examples that we're going to be bringing up here were widely publicized. They've been in school books. They've been, for decades, they've been in school books. And some of these are still in the books today. But we're going to go through each one and show you what it is. This is the first one. Neanderthals were found, first of all, in 1856. Darwin wrote his book about the same time, this origin of species. So this is one of the first fossils that they found, and they were found in a valley called Neander Valley in France. What they found was a skull cap and a couple of limb bones. They looked very human, but they were different. Anatomy professors at the time, this is back in the 1850s, anatomy professors said, those are humans, but they have rickets, scurvy, right? That's what they said. But people said, no, this is an evolutionary form. You know, it's not human, it's got to be something that's evolutionary. In 1908, they found a complete skeleton, and then the paleontologists, these are the guys who were studying those things, they reconstructed it, and they believed that the Neanderthal people were direct descendants of humans as we know them today. Rather not a direct descendant, but rather they were in a side branch. In other words, they came from monkeys, but they went off here, whereas humans went off in a different direction. So they said they're an extinct species that's gone off from there. But in 1957, so now remember, we're 100 years later after they first started saying this is an evolutionary thing. 100 years later, 2 medical examiners concluded that the reconstruction of these bones was totally wrong. They had built these things as though they were hunched over, that they were normally like an ape. Whereas now they say in the proper reconstruction they walked upright like humans. They say that nowadays, the difference between Neanderthals and humans is only superficial. Most creationists, and there's a long, you can get into a long study, Neanderthals, according to creation evidence and the creation theories, came about after the flood. After the flood, there was 700 years in which there was huge amounts of, it's a huge long study, there's many textbooks on it, but the earth was covered in debris from volcanoes, volcanic action. And so there was very little sunlight. And to get scurvy, you have to have no sunlight. And these people lived basically under year-round cloud, you know, so they weren't getting sun. And they ended up with scurvy. So most people believe that this was they're direct humans, but they had scurvy. All right, the next one. Java Man, 1891. In Java, over in the Indian Ocean. The guy found an ape skull cap and a human thigh bone. They were 50 feet apart in the ground. But he said they're from the same creature. He dated them at 500,000 years. This is in 1891. There's no dating system. He says, well, this must be 500,000 years. Just pick the number out of the air. There's no radio dating, there's no nothing. So 500,000 years is what he said. No other scientist could find any substantiating evidence that it was anything. They went back and looked. They went to the area and they found human skulls in the area, many human skulls. And finally, they did admit that the whole thing was just a mistake. So again, but this was in textbooks for many years, back at the turn of the century. So this is nothing but a mistake when they put it together. This one is an interesting one. What they found was the dark areas. So this is part of a skull cap that they found. This is a reconstruction in plaster. And same thing here. They found this part of a jaw here. and the rest of this is made out of plaster. Now, 1908, they found part of the skull in a gravel pit in Piltdown, England. And then in 1912, so 4 years later, they found the lower jaw. We're here. They found this piece of the lower jaw, and it was in the same gravel pit. They said that the second piece, that jaw, confirmed that it was a missing link, all right? Because they constructed this thing as between parabola and U-shape, so they're saying it's a missing link. In 1953, it was discovered to be a fraud. Nobody knows how, but what they did, they took a modern skull and they treated it with chemicals to make it look old. They took the jaw of an ape and they took a file and they filed it so that it would fit into their reconstruction of this jaw in here, the way they put it together. It's a hoax. Nobody knows how. Now, why wouldn't they see this? The first thing is, if they find a fossil here and they find this piece, there's one piece of bone, and they're considered so valuable that no one is allowed to touch them. They lock them away in a safe. And then they make casts. So the casts are sent out, and that's all they have, is a mold that supposedly is this piece. So when they made the mold, you couldn't see all the file marks, but in 1953, they actually got a hold of the bone and they could see the file marks and they could see the chemical treatment in this thing. So for decades, Piltdown Man was considered to be a link, missing link between ape and human. This one. Love this one. 1922, they found a single tooth. Found a tooth. This is the reconstruction of what they saw. At the Museum of Natural History in Chicago, they made a great big scene like this. They had all these things made up, right? All based on a tooth.
That was my tooth.
Guess what? They discovered that the tooth belongs to this pig. That pig they found is still alive in Paraguay in South America.
Wow.
It's in the jungles of Paraguay, based on the tooth. Now, they had this huge diorama of Nebraska Man. What did they do with it? Take it and throw it away in the dump, right? No, they put it up on the third floor instead of in the front lobby, and it's still on the third floor of the Chicago Museum of Natural History if you want to go and see what one of our ancestors looked like. Except they don't think he looked like a pig, but it's still there. They don't want to get rid of it. So we've got all kinds of problems with these things. Every one of these things that they keep coming up with have been found to be frauds. Now, this one is, what's the name? Peking Man, found in China. They found 2 teeth in 1922. Then they found another tooth in 1927 at the same location. Then they found a near complete brain case, the skull, in 1929. They estimated it then to be about 500,000 years old. The brain case was bigger than an ape, but it was at the very small end of the human being range. So they said, it's got to be a missing link. But what they didn't want to tell you was that they found all kinds of signs of fire and crude tools in the same place. I believe this is the one that the fire, they were basically like a furnace. They had 30 feet of ash there. At the same place, they found many monkey brains because in that part of the world, they used to eat monkey brains, and they would just, take the head and cook it and then just eat the brains right out of the skull and then throw the skull away. It was a delicacy. So they found all kinds of evidence of human workmanship in the thing. The pieces that they found of this thing were lost. Somehow they've been lost right after the Second World War. Sometime in the late 40s, every one of these pieces of the fossil had gone missing. No one in the world knows where they are. So that's all we got. Their evidence points to the fact that they were fully human, but we don't even have fossils to look at anymore of this one. This one. Town fossil. A professor was given this. Somebody found it in Africa, 1924. They dated it then between 2 and 3 million years old. They had a lot of skepticism amongst people looking at this thing and saying that it can't really be there. But by 1960, it was fully accepted as a missing link, and it was put into all the school textbooks. In 1973, so this is how many years? 50 years after. Geologists went to the place where they found this thing. They went to the cave where they found these bones, and they said, we got a problem here because that cave is not even 1 million years old. How can the bones be more than, between 2 and 3 million years old? The skull could not be older than just a few 100,000 years. So, it was in the textbooks, but now all of a sudden, it's a mistake. They don't really know anything about it now. All right, this one. Pardon me one second, I've got to do a quick look here. Go back to this. There we are. Okay. Here we are. Okay. This thing was found in East Africa. Nope, wrong one. Okay. They found several jaw fragments and several teeth, okay? By 1977, so now we're looking at another 40 years later, they had found 43 specimens of this thing, but everything they found was always jaws and teeth. The jaw pointed to a human-like creature, and it was considered an intermediate between humans and apes. But then they finally said that it has nothing to do with human origins. This thing is an ape, any way you look at it. The fragments that they found could be assembled into many different positions, into many different directions. They discovered a baboon in Ethiopia in 1970 that was very similar to everything they found in this one, as Ramapithecus, but it was very human-like. So there is an ape that has very human-like jaws, and it's almost identical to this. So instead of being an old fossil, it's now realized that it's partly human. Now, this one is called Nutcracker Man. This was found in 1959, and it's got huge jaws and big molars in the thing. So they said that it was great for cracking nuts. They found stone tools. The guy was dated, or said to be 1.8 million years old, and he was a tool maker because they found signs of tools, rock tools. So they said, well, obviously he's a missing link to man. In 1964, so we're talking just a few years later, another creature was found a few hundred yards away. It was also dated at 1.8 million years, but it was very much like a human. But at the same site were many hundreds of other animal bones and stone tools of all sorts. 1913, this is way back before, they had found a fully human skeleton right there in the same spot. But these guys in 1959 refused to release the news that they had already found a human skeleton there because it would take away from the fact that obviously humans and this thing lived together, so it couldn't be a missing link. So it finally came out many years later, and then they finally did tests in 1974 on the skull, and the tests that they did showed that it could not be more than 20,000 years old. So instead of being 1.8 million years, it's less than 20,000 years. And they also had human skeletons that they found in exactly the same place. Skull 1470. This is a number that's out of a museum. That's all they've ever put on this one here. It was found in Kenya, and it was found below some ground that had already been dated at 2.6 million years. So they estimated the skull at 2.9 million years old. But the skull is too big. It's a human skull. So therefore they have a problem with that. When they reconstructed the pieces, they made this thing with a sloped forehead. It's a long sloped forehead to make it look more like an ape than a human. But it's believed that it was fully an ape. Now, this is the most current fossil that is in the textbooks today. Lucy. Johansson, I think was the guy's name that found it. They found the thing in 1973. They found several pieces of a knee joint, and they fitted it together and said that because of the angle, it had to be, it wasn't a human, it had to be an ape, and it had to be in the lead up to this. So they claimed it was 3 million years old. And then in 1974, a year later, they found 40% of a fossilized skeleton. It was 3.5 feet tall. They dated it at 3.5 million years. 1975, they had 13 more individuals of the same style that they had found. So within a few years, they found quite a number of these things. They were portrayed as very small but powerful. They had human-like bodies but ape heads. They were put into this whole category to be an addition to it. By 1994, rather, they had found 53 more specimens. Some parts looked human, some parts looked male, ape. There was all kinds of things that they get into with this thing. But the most interesting thing, I have a documentary on a DVD. And there's a documentary that National Geographic put out. When you look at a human bone, the human hip bone, it basically is facing, like if you're looking at it from the front, it's like where my hands are. Because when we walk this way. But an ape, the hip bones go this way, and apes are bow-legged. They waddle side to side. So the bones that they found were this way, which says they're fully ape. In this documentary, this one guy said he had this, it finally came to him. When this thing got buried, it was under so much pressure that the bones all collapsed and crushed up, and then they reshaped into the wrong position. That's a documentary that they're still using to say. They're still saying that because the bones all broke and then they reshaped as the earth shifted into a perfect position for a human thing, that the thing has to be human. This is in the textbooks today as an ancestor. And again, I keep talking about these dates of millions of years. And next week when we talk about the age of the earth, you're going to be astounded when we start looking at some of these things. All right, so we've been looking at all these human fossils, the common elements that define these things. First thing is they find a fossil, and they study it. They assume in every case it must be a missing link. But then finally, more investigation shows that it was a mistake. It was an error. But meanwhile, the educational system has got this in all the books, and everybody's been fed all this false information. And that's been true with every single one of these human fossils that they have found. I want you to pay attention to this. It's 2 slides, what this guy wrote. In Science Digest of May of 1992, this guy Lyle Watson wrote an article called The Water People. The fossils that decorate our family tree are so scarce that there are still more scientists than specimens. The remarkable fact is that all the physical evidence we have for human evolution can be placed with room to spare inside a single coffin. Every bone that they have ever found. Now, before I go on, I want to just mention this. The flood. 1,656 years after creation, God flooded the entire earth. What did they find? What are the most common types of fossils that they find? Fish. The shellfish, right? Mostly. Of all that numbers, those numbers I showed you before, mostly shellfish. They're down on the bottom. Now remember, when there's this thing in the oceans, the deep split, and there was water all over the place, mud came down, and it buried these things. But when it comes to land, what happens? It was a flood, and they're coming up. What about elephants? What about these big, heavy animals? Can they run and get out of the water? No, they get overtaken. And then they would get buried in there. Who can keep away from the water the longest? Humans, right? They keep climbing and climbing and climbing until the entire earth was overwhelmed with water. Now, they're on top. What happens when a body's in the water for a year? It decomposes. There's nothing there. And because they're up so high, there's no mud to bury them in. They can't fossilize. So, what you're going to find is this, the common thing is that all these things that were in the oceans and low down, and then the animals as they're coming up that can't get away, they're the things that are going to be fossilized. That's why there's less than a coffin full of bones, including teeth and jaws, to show elements, to show humans. All right, continuing in this thing, he says, not surprisingly, despite the diligent research done in East Africa by paleontologists Richard Leakey and Donald Johanson, there are gaping holes in the evolutionary record, some of them extending for 4 to 6 million years. Modern apes, for instance, seem to have sprung out of nowhere. And the true origin of modern humans of upright, naked, tool-making, big-brain beings, if we are to be honest with ourselves, an equally mysterious matter. They have no idea. This is an evolutionist. This is what he writes. That's not a creationist. He admits, and I've got a whole book, it's called Their Own Words Against Them. I've got a book that's about 500 pages, and it's loaded with quotes of evolutionists who say the same thing. We can't prove it. There's nothing there. We have nothing to go by. So let's leave the fossils and that, because this gets into some of the most fascinating stuff, I think. Dinosaurs. Dinosaurs. They're animals, and I'm going to say mostly extinct. There's many fossils of dinosaurs. They got caught. The word dinosaur, it was called actually dinosauria, came from the Greek, and it was not coined until 1842, or it was from the Greek, 1842. And it means terrible lizard. But the question we have to ask is, were these dinosaurs like lizards? Were they cold or warm-blooded? What about the hip structures on these things? The first studies of these bones and fossils was in the early 1800s. Before that, they were nothing. Nobody ever knew anything. There was no records of them. Nobody, if they found them, they just ignored them. But they found all sizes and shapes. Very small, the size of chickens, to huge, the average about the size of a hippopotamus. So, reptiles grow as long as they live. The longer they live, the bigger they get. There's a huge size possible. So, we have dinosaurs that are huge, right? We have dinosaurs that are small. Does anybody know what the average size of a dinosaur is? A sheep. The size of a sheep. Of all the dinosaurs they've ever found, the size of a sheep. We only look at these big Tyrannosaurus rex and the big Apatosauruses and these big ones. But there's very few of those. The great majority, they're really tiny ones, but the great majority of them just average out to be around the size of a sheep. The other thing is, did they come from live birth or did they come from eggs? Where do reptiles come from? Nobody can say, because they can't, until they can find a fossil inside of an egg, they can't say, right, how they were born. What about the skin? Some skin has been found that they think it was blue and yellow and orange, but we always paint them as green, right? Because that's a lizard, right? We don't know, but they think that they believe in some creationists is that God put dinosaurs there like a peacock. They were beautiful. They were bright colors. But we really don't know. How did they eat? Right? Did they eat flesh? Did they eat, well, what does the Bible tell us? The Bible tells us that up until the flood, up until after the flood, they only ate vegetation. It was only after the flood that anyone, all people, animals and everything were included, they could eat flesh. But up until then, they were all at that point. So if it came about in the flood, they were all that. Pandas. Pandas have very sharp teeth that are very common for flesh-eating bears. But guess what? They don't eat any flesh at all. They only eat bamboo sprouts. Their teeth are totally wrong for what they eat, but they don't know that, so they just continue on. What about how fast dinosaurs are? You know, we keep seeing these Jurassic Park movies and they show how fast dinosaurs are. How do we know how fast they went? The only thing they can do is they can look at footprints when they find them and say, well, obviously he had to be going fast, and they can try to hypothesize. Most of them were not that fast. What about their intelligence? What about their voice? Did they have any kind of a voice? We don't know. Jurassic Park is Hollywood, so we have no idea if they made any sounds at all. Fire breathing. Is it possible that you could be fire-breathing dragons? Absolutely yes. How can we say that? Creationists say that that's a very great possibility. Because when they ate all kinds of stuff. They could have rocks. And if you take flint and you scratch flint together, what do you get? A spark. The other thing is, what animal in the world today makes more noxious gas, methane gas, than anything else? Cows. Cows produce more methane gas than anything else. And if you have a spark, you get an explosion, you get a fire, right? So you could have this. The other thing is we have electric eels. We have fireflies and so on that do these things. There's electricity in some animals, and that could be in the dinosaur. We don't know because we've only got fossilized bones. And then the other question you have to ask in this is, how did they go extinct? If they died, the last dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. What made them go extinct? The prevailing theory, it's called DDT, dinosaur demise theories. The latest DDT is that it was a comet or an asteroid that hit in the Gulf of Mexico and upset the Earth, and it, killed them all. But there are theories out there that they died from AIDS. There's theories out there that they died from starvation. Volcanoes killed them all off. Disease. And creationists say man killed most of them off. But there's also other things. The environment after the flood completely changed on the Earth. Huge changes to the Earth. And those dinosaurs could not live in the world as it was. Now, the Bible mentions creatures called dragons many times. I'll give you notes after, but some of these verses are there. Psalm 91:13 says, "Thou shalt tread upon the lion and adder, the young lion and the dragon shalt thou trample under feet." So there's several of these things. Isaiah 43:20, Isaiah 27:1. They keep talking about dragons. Now, King James Bible was written in 1610, first published. They called them dragons. There was no such word as a dinosaur. I'm going to give you I'm going to read a whole passage out of Job. I want you to pay attention to this. This is Job. Job 45 verse 15. It says, "Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee. I made with you." Right? "He eats grass as an ox. Lo, now his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his stones are wrapped together." Modern translations say, when they don't say behemoth, they say hippopotamus. Have you ever seen a hippopotamus with a tail that looks like a cedar tree? No. Have you ever seen a hippopotamus that has a huge power in all their hind legs? No, it's in the front, right? It doesn't fit anywhere in there. But this goes on. "He is the chief of the ways of God. He that made him can make his sword to approach unto him. Surely the mountains bring him forth food, where all the beasts of the field play. He lies under the shady tree in the covert of the reeds and fens. The shady trees cover him with their shadow. The willows of the brook compass him about. Behold, he drinks up a river and hastens not. He trusts that he can draw up Jordan into his mouth. He takes it with his eyes. His nose pierces through snares." This thing is a perfect description of dinosaur, right? Now, I'm going to start talking biblical in these things here. God created all animals, land animals, on day 6. And then he created man. He created Adam and Eve. He created dinosaurs at the same time. Noah, when the flood came, had 2 animals of every kind. It says in the Bible, he had 2 of every kind. Did he take dinosaurs on the ark? He had to. Either that or we've been lied to. That book isn't worth reading, right? It says he took 2 of every kind. Dinosaurs were on the earth. The dinosaurs had to go on the earth. And people say, well, how could he fit them all? God's not stupid. He didn't send these 200-year-old dinosaurs that are 75 feet tall. He would send the babies, right? And they would take them in there. So they would be small. Remember, they grow consistently. That's the theory on them anyway. So he would have small creatures in the thing. There are textbooks written that are on Noah's Ark, and it's amazing when you start seeing that. How could 8 people take care of all of these animals for a year? And how could they carry enough food and all this stuff? And it's amazing when you see that. But anyway, now I'm going to go another aside. Genesis, 1st chapter, verse 21 says, "And God created great whales and every living creature that moves, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good." He created great whales. Now we're going to jump ahead to Exodus. We're going to talk about Moses going to Pharaoh. When Pharaoh shall, this is God speaking to Moses, he says, when Pharaoh shall speak unto you, saying, show a miracle for you, then you shall say to Aaron, take your rod and cast it before Pharaoh, and it shall become a serpent. And Moses and Aaron went in unto Pharaoh, and they did so as the Lord had commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, now the magicians of Egypt. They also did in like manner with their enchantments, for they cast down every man his rod, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. What's the relationship between what I read in Genesis and here? The word great whales is the same word in Hebrew as serpent. Can you imagine a great whale appearing in front of Pharaoh? 100-foot long whale flopping around in the thing? No. The word is tanine. Back in the 1600s, they didn't know what it was. The word tanine is most properly now translated as dinosaur. Believe it or not. When you get into this, when you start studying the Hebrew and you start going through these things, he created dinosaurs and all of these other things in that, you know, the fish and the stuff in the sea.
I want to ask you a question. When you say they misinterpreted the word hippopotamus, whose interpretation are we talking about? Are we talking about the Greek?
No. In Job, that's Hebrew, right? When we're talking about that. The modern people, when you read the new versions, the modern versions of the Bible, they don't call it a dragon, or they don't call it behemoth. In the case of Job, they say it's a hippopotamus when you go into that modern one. And in, again, a lot of cases, they use modern animals. They'll say jackal in other cases for some animals. I forget where it is. Anyway, that's one word they use now, jackal, but it's a different word in the King James. So it's modern translations that don't want to believe in the biblical translations, right? So you have to get into studying a lot of the languages. I'm just pointing out that even the King James has got a lot of errors in it, in the sense of they didn't know what he meant. So because he was talking about water and fish in that one verse, they just said great whales. But later on, they call it a serpent. They didn't even know what dinosaurs were in the 1600s. There was no such word. They didn't even know about these creatures. So again, nowadays we can look at it and we can say that these things are literally dinosaurs. Okay, there are legends all around the world of dragons. China, their national symbol is a dragon. They've got dragon stories, there's pictures, there's pottery and carvings of dragons all over, and they are basically like dinosaurs. Everybody's seen the picture of St. George in England with a spear and he's got his foot up on a dinosaur, right? Where did that come from? He supposedly killed this big creature, whatever it was, but it's a dinosaur when you look at the picture. In the 1500s, there was a European scientific book called Historia Animalism, and it listed several animals resembling dinosaurs that were still alive in the 1500s. Now, let's start looking at different things. There is no scientific proof that supports the theory that dinosaurs lived more than 65 million years ago. There's no scientific facts at all. Speculation only based on a belief in evolution. That's all it is. They picked a number of it. Living dinosaurs have been found today, and there's evidence that others may still be living. Right? So, we're going to look at some. This happened in the Pacific Ocean, somewhere near New Zealand. 1977, a Japanese fishing trawler dragged this thing up. Every Japanese fishing trawler has a biologist on board. I don't know why, but they do. They took samples of this before they threw it in. It would contaminate all their stock. So they basically caught it, photographed it, took samples, and then threw the thing back in the ocean. Japanese scientists claim that its DNA is like nothing else in the world. There's no such thing like it anywhere in the world. American scientists say it's just a rotting basking shark. But down at the bottom, that's what a plesiosaur looks like. Does that look like a shark up here? Or a whale? So again, we don't know. But the Japanese say there's nothing else like it in the world. There's no other DNA, anything like it. So, if they found that in 1977, do you think there's any of them living? Maybe. The coelacanth fish. It was claimed to be extinct 66 million years ago. And then in 1938, a fisherman off the coast of India caught one. As of today, they have found 28 colonies in the Indian Ocean. Huge numbers of these fish that were supposedly extinct 66 million years ago. 1925, there's a photograph. What is it? I don't know. Nobody knows. But to me, does it look like a dinosaur? Well, I don't know. So, there's also evidence that dragons or dinosaurs and man lived together in recent years. I've been to this place, Glen Rose, Texas. It's called a Creation Evidence Museum there. Carl Baugh runs this place. And some absolutely fascinating things. In the lower picture here, you can see a dinosaur footprint and a man footprint. When we were there, they had dinosaur footprints that would be between 2 and 3 feet around. In the middle of it, there was a human adult footprint and a child's footprint. And as they looked at these things where they were going through, because they were basically crossing through this river, and as they were crossing this river in the mud, it looked like the father, it looked like a man, had his son by the hand. And you know how kids go when you're walking, they try to jump, right? They're jumping. And so this kid was jumping from one dinosaur track to the next. Evolutionists came along and said, oh, that's just all a luck, that's just a big hoax. Somebody came along and they chipped or they carved in the human footprints inside the dinosaur footprint, just to show this. So what they did is they took a brand new one, they carved it out of the ground, and they cut it absolutely in half, right through the footprints. And when you take mud and you fossilize it, if it's cut, you'll see these lines, because everything goes in lines, right? The mud depresses and then it shapes into that. Well, they found these lines go right around. That footprint was made in the mud, fresh mud, with a dinosaur print. It was not cut, because none of the lines were cut. So they proved that. On one weekend, they called the news reports out. This was back in the 1970s. They called newspaper reporters out, and they said, there's the tracks. We want you guys, news reporters, pick a place where you want us to dig. You know, there's the track. They were going that way. You pick a place up there, and we will dig there next Saturday. They did it on a Saturday. All the news reporters came out. They had all the machinery there, and they dug down. They got permission from a farmer, and they dug down in his field. And lo and behold, they found more tracks with human footprints inside the tracks. And the reporters said, nobody cares anyway, when they never even reported it. They don't want to report it. So where do you go from there? We have carvings and drawings, petroglyphs. The carving up here at the top is in Thailand. It's at a temple. It's 1,000 years old. How did they know what, that's a stegosaurus. How did they know what a stegosaurus looked like 1,000 years ago? They never even started researching these things until the 1800s. This is on a cliff about 50 feet off the bottom. It's on the White River in Utah, southern Utah. It's been now put out of bounds. No one is allowed to go there except under special scientific research. There's a whole bunch of paintings on the wall. There's deer, there's cows, there's dogs, there's people. And then scientists say, well, we don't know what that is. Well, it sure looks like a T-Rex or something like that, you know, because it's all stylized type of thing. So there are all kinds of these things around the world. Ica's in Peru. There was a huge earthquake there, and they have stones. I got to tell you that in 1990, I think it was 98, I was in White Rock listening to a guy talk about dinosaurs, and he had an Ica stone. The Ica stone was about 18 inches tall. The bottom had been cut off. On one side of it was a T-Rex, and on the other side was a Stegosaurus. Now, the Stegosaurus is the animal that's on 4 legs, and on the back it has those diamond plates, right? The rock was found in 1960. Perfect identical thing of the T-Rex. The other side was a Stegosaurus. And when they found it, they said, it's just a hoax. Somebody just painted this thing. Because until 1996, paleontologists constructed that thing as having 2 rows of those plates, getting smaller and smaller down into the tail. But in 1996, they decided that they had been reconstructing them wrong. It was a single row of those diamond plates, and one went left, one went right, left, right, left, right, left, right, all the way down. This rock that I had in my hand in 98 that was found in 1960 showed the thing with this single line, back and forth. If it's a hoax, how did they know? The other thing is, all of these ecostones are 1,000 years old. There are thousands and thousands of them. In 1963, there was a medical doctor from UCLA. He was down on one of these things, and they opened one, and they found the whole cave was full of medical rocks. And he said, this is an operation that no human being has ever done. We plan to do it next year, 1995 or 1965. But they had it here was the entire explanation of how to do the operation carved into this rock 1,000 years ago. So, evolutionists keep wanting to turn these aside. Some of these things actually show humans riding on the backs of dinosaurs. How did these people 1,000 years ago know what these dinosaurs look like and get them so accurate? They sure didn't put them together. They saw them. That's the only explanation you can come up with. Now, this is the most amazing thing. Dinosaur bones have been found with blood cells and stretchy ligaments attached. There's one right there. Very small, came from the inside of a bone, right on a bone end. It was in the late 1980s. They found a T-Rex in Wyoming, and then a student, Mary Schweitzer was her name, she was at the University of Colorado. She was working on this while her professor was away on sabbatical. He came back and she said, we have a problem. We have a dinosaur bone with red blood cells. And he says, you got to prove it's not red blood cells. She said, we've been trying for months and months and we can't. It is red blood cells. Then she moved to Duke University in North Carolina. They had another skeleton came from the same place. And this is where they found this. Ligaments that are still stretchy with blood. Now, back in the 1970s, they did a determination that no DNA and no flesh could ever exist for more than 10,000 years. And the response is, well, obviously we were wrong. There's got to be some way to last 65 million years. Can you imagine a piece of flesh staying stretchy for 65 million years? We've got dinosaurs with stretchy bones, with blood cells and everything else. So again, what do we look at? So again, why is it important for us to look critically at both fossils and dinosaurs? And we're coming down to the same thing. If we start believing in these long ages, and why are people looking at long ages? Because they don't want to have a God. But God created the entire earth and everything in it in 6 days. The Bible tells us that. The Bible is the inerrant word of God. There's not a lie anywhere in that book. There's no errors in that book. He says he did it in 6 days. Not 6 million years. A day is not a year. A day is not 1,000 years. It's days, literally. There's a 99.9% assurance that the word, the way it's described there, is the most absolute way you can describe anything. There's a morning and a night. There's day and night. There's the whole works. And you can't get around it. Either God's lied to us, and it means everything's worthless, or it was a literal day. Every single man that lived from the time of Adam right through today is a sinner. Now, if we are judged according to God's standards, which says you can't have anything wrong, you can never have taken anything, you can't steal anything, you can't take a pencil from work if it's not yours, you can't do any of these things, you can't tell a lie. Show me a kid that hasn't lied. Look, I can look at every one of you here, and I know you've all lied. You lie to your wife every time she says, do I look good in this? Of course, you have to, right? If you want to say a lie, you have to lie. We all have that problem. But every time we go against these things, we become a sinner. And a sinner is destined to hell. There's no ifs, ands, there's no way around it. But again, as we all know, God did provide that means of salvation. We can spend eternity with Him. Absolutely no question. Oops, I got to get it twice. So, we all know this. He sent His Son to come to earth. Christ lived a perfectly righteous life. He died a horrible death. And through all of that, we can come to Him, we can come to God the Father in Christ's perfection. We are blameless. There's nothing that can go wrong with us. He's justified us. He put that gavel down and said, innocent. He didn't say not guilty. He said innocent. We are innocent of anything that's ever happened once we are in Christ. So, we all have salvation in Christ, and that's the only way we can have it. Next week, I'm going to talk about the age of the earth. We're going to get into a lot of radio dating and that kind of stuff. But for now, we're just going to leave it there. I'm going to be here for a while after, so if anybody's got questions, we won't hold everybody else. We'll just let Dean come up, and next week, or after this, I can answer some more questions.